Adeline Foster gripped the edge of the carriage door and stepped down onto the cold stone path, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the driver could hear it. In 1 hour she would be married to a man she had met only twice. In 1 hour her family's debts would vanish, and her father's name would be safe again. She looked up at the towering front of Whitmore Hall, its gray walls rising against a pale morning sky, and told herself this was simply the price of survival. Inside the chapel, candles burned along the stone walls, and a small group of guests sat in silence. There was no music, no laughter, no joy in the air. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood at the altar already, tall and still, his face carved from something colder than marble. He did not smile when she approached. He did not reach for her hand until the priest instructed him to. "You may begin," the priest said. Alexander's fingers closed around hers, firm but distant, as though he were shaking hands with a business partner rather than taking a wife. Adeline kept her chin lifted and her eyes forward, refusing to let anyone in that chapel see how frightened she was. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of strangers who already looked at her like an outsider who had bought her way into their world. The ceremony passed quickly. Vows were spoken, rings were exchanged, and within 20 minutes, Adeline Foster became the Duchess of Whitmore. There was no kiss, no embrace, nothing that resembled affection. Alexander simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the doors of the chapel as though the entire event had been nothing more than the signing of a contract. Adeline followed him outside, her hand still trembling from where his had gripped it. The guests offered polite congratulations, though none of them met her eyes for long. An older woman, dressed in deep violet with silver hair pulled into a severe knot, watched Adeline with an expression that was neither warm nor cruel, simply calculating. "That is my mother," Alexander said quietly as they walked toward the main hall. "The Dowager Duchess Margaret. She will have opinions about you. Ignore most of them." "Most of them?" Adeline asked. "The important ones you should listen to," he said. "The rest are simply her way of reminding everyone that this house was hers first." It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her all morning, and Adeline found herself almost grateful for it, until his tone shifted back to something flat and businesslike. "We should discuss the terms of this arrangement," he said, leading her into a private study just off the main corridor. He closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing near the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I assume you already understand why this marriage exists," he began. "Your father owed a debt he could not pay. I offered a solution that benefited us both. Your family keeps its name, its land, and its future. In exchange, you carry my name and give this house the appearance of continuity." Adeline sat straight in her chair, refusing to let her hands shake in her lap. "And what does that mean for me exactly? What is my role here?" "You will have a wing of the house to yourself," Alexander said. "You may decorate it as you wish, order what you need, and live comfortably. You will attend certain public events with me when required, and you will behave as a duchess should when guests are present. Beyond that, I ask nothing of you."
"Nothing at all?"
she asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "This marriage means nothing beyond what I have described," he said, finally turning to look at her directly. His eyes were a deep, unreadable gray, and for a moment, Adeline thought she saw something flicker behind them, something tired and guarded, before it vanished completely. "I will not pretend otherwise, and I would not insult you by pretending you expected romance from this arrangement. We are strangers bound by a contract, nothing more." The words landed harder than she expected, though she was careful not to let it show. She had known, of course, that this was not a love match. She had known from the moment her father first mentioned the Duke's name over dinner, his voice trembling with relief at the thought of a solution to their ruin. But hearing it stated so plainly, so coldly, in a room with no warmth and no softness, made something in her chest tighten painfully. "I understand," she said, keeping her voice even. "I did not come here expecting affection, Your Grace. I came here to do what was necessary." Something in his expression shifted slightly at her tone, though she could not tell if it was surprise or approval. "Good," he said simply. "Then we understand each other." He left the room without another word, and Adeline sat alone in the silence for a long moment, staring at the cold fireplace across from her. She had expected loneliness. She had expected distance. She had not expected the particular ache of being dismissed so completely by the man she had just promised her life to. Later that evening, a young maid named Eleanor helped her settle into her new chambers, a beautiful suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams, clearly untouched for years. As Eleanor unpacked her trunks, she glanced toward the door nervously before speaking. "You should know, Your Grace," Eleanor said quietly. "The Duke does not often speak of personal matters. It is not because he dislikes you. It has been this way since before I came to work here." "Since when?" Adeline asked, curious despite herself. Eleanor hesitated, folding a shawl with careful hands. "There was a woman, years ago. His fiancée before you. I do not know the whole story, only that something happened, and the Duke has not been the same since. He keeps everyone at a distance now. Family included." Adeline absorbed this information quietly, filing it away without comment. She was not here to unravel the mysteries of her husband's past. She was here to survive, to fulfill her end of the arrangement, and to give her family the safety they desperately needed. That night, alone in the enormous four-poster bed in her new chambers, Adeline listened to the wind moving through the trees outside her window. Alexander had not come to her rooms, had not even sent word wishing her well on their wedding night. She told herself she did not mind. She told herself this was exactly what she had agreed to, nothing more and nothing less. But as she lay awake in the darkness of a house that did not yet feel like home, she could not stop thinking about the brief flicker she had seen in his eyes during their conversation, the moment where the ice seemed to crack, just slightly, before he sealed it shut again. She wondered what kind of pain could build a wall that strong, and despite every warning in her mind telling her not to care, some small part of her wanted to know the answer. Somewhere down the hall, in his own private study, Alexander sat by the fire with a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He told himself the marriage changed nothing. He told himself he had built his life around control, around distance, around never again allowing himself to be vulnerable to another person's choices. He had learned that lesson once, painfully, and he did not intend to learn it twice. Yet something about the way Adeline Foster had looked at him in that study, steady and unflinching even as he delivered his coldest words, stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. She had not begged for warmth. She had not pretended to feel something she did not. She had simply accepted the terms and asked for clarity, and there had been a strange kind of strength in that, a strength he had not expected from a woman forced into marriage to save her family. He pushed the thought away and finished his drink in one swallow. This marriage was a transaction, nothing more, and he intended to keep it that way. He had learned, the hard way, exactly what happened to men who let themselves believe otherwise. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of Whitmore Hall, as if the house itself sensed that something had changed within its walls, even if neither of its new occupants was ready to admit it yet. The next morning, Adeline woke early, long before the household stirred, and decided to explore the halls of her new home while it was still quiet. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked slowly through the long corridors, taking in the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the tall windows that let in thin streams of gray light, and the silence that seemed to press against every wall. She found herself in a long gallery filled with paintings, and paused before one in particular, a portrait of a younger Alexander standing beside an older man she assumed was his father. Even as a boy, his expression held the same guardedness she had seen in him the day before, though there was something softer around his eyes, something not yet hardened by whatever had happened to him since. "That was painted the year before his father passed," came a voice behind her. Adeline turned to find the Dowager Duchess Margaret standing a few feet away, dressed in dark green, her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was no warmth in her expression, but no open hostility either, simply the careful, measuring look of a woman who missed nothing. "I did not mean to intrude," Adeline said. "You are the Duchess now," Margaret replied evenly. "You may walk wherever you wish in this house. Whether you are welcome is a separate question entirely, and one I have not yet decided." Adeline held her gaze, refusing to shrink beneath the older woman's scrutiny. "I understand your caution, Your Grace. This marriage was not born of romance, and I do not expect you to pretend otherwise on my behalf." Something shifted slightly in Margaret's expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect. "At least you are honest," she said. "Most women in your position would have tried to charm me by now." "I am not most women," Adeline said simply, "and I did not come here to charm anyone. I came here because my family needed saving, and your son offered a solution. I intend to honor my end of that agreement, nothing more." Margaret studied her for a long moment before turning to leave, pausing only briefly at the end of the gallery. "My son has not smiled in 3 years," she said quietly, not quite looking back. "I do not say this to burden you, only so that you understand what you have married into. Whatever happened to him before you arrived, it took something from him that has not yet returned." She left before Adeline could respond, and Adeline stood alone in the gallery for a long while afterward, staring at the portrait of the boy who had not yet learned to build walls so high that nothing could reach him. Breakfast that morning was a quiet, formal affair. Alexander sat at the head of the long table, reading through papers as a servant poured his coffee, while Adeline sat several seats away, feeling the distance between them stretch far beyond the length of polished wood separating their chairs. Margaret joined briefly, offered a few clipped remarks about the weather, and departed just as quickly, leaving the two of them alone in a silence that felt heavier with every passing minute. "You slept well, I hope," Alexander said eventually, not looking up from his papers. "Well enough," Adeline replied. "Your home is very quiet." "It has always been this way," he said. "I find I prefer it." She studied him for a moment, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened slightly whenever silence stretched too long. "Your mother mentioned you have not smiled in 3 years," she said carefully, watching for his reaction. His hand paused over the papers, just briefly, before continuing as though she had not spoken at all. "My mother says many things," he said. "Most of them are not your concern." "I did not ask out of curiosity for gossip," Adeline said. "I asked because we are meant to share a life now, even if it is only in appearance. I would rather understand the man I am living beside than stumble blindly through every conversation." Alexander finally looked up at her, his gray eyes sharp and unreadable. "You do not need to understand me, Duchess. You need only fulfill the role we agreed upon. That is all this marriage requires of either of us." The coldness in his voice was deliberate, she realized, a wall built and reinforced with practiced precision. She did not push further, though she filed away the flicker of pain she thought she saw across his face before he masked it entirely. Whatever had happened to him, it clearly still lived beneath the surface, waiting, unspoken, for a moment when his control might finally slip. She finished her breakfast in silence and excused herself to explore the gardens, needing air, needing space from the weight of a house so full of secrets. As she walked among the neatly trimmed hedges, she found herself wondering how long she would last in a marriage built entirely on distance, and whether any part of the man she had married still remembered how to let someone close. Behind her, unseen from the garden path, Alexander watched from his study window as his new wife walked alone beneath the gray morning sky, her shoulders straight despite everything she had already endured in less than a full day beneath his roof. He told himself again that this meant nothing. He told himself the ache building quietly in his chest was simply unfamiliarity, nothing more. He was not yet ready to admit how wrong he might be. 3 weeks into her marriage, Adeline had learned the rhythm of Whitmore Hall, the way one learns the habits of a stranger sharing the same roof. Alexander rose early and disappeared into his study for hours, emerging only for meals he ate in near silence. Margaret kept to her own wing, appearing mainly to offer sharp observations disguised as pleasantries. The servants moved quietly through the halls, careful never to disturb the fragile peace that held the household together. Adeline had expected loneliness, but she had not expected the particular restlessness that came with having nothing to do. She had grown up managing her family's modest estate, balancing accounts, negotiating with tenants, solving problems her father was too proud to admit existed. Here, in a house far grander than anything she had known, she had no purpose beyond existing quietly in her assigned wing. It was this restlessness that led her, one rainy afternoon, into the estate's record room, a small chamber tucked behind the library, where ledgers and correspondence were stored. She told herself she was merely curious, merely looking for something to occupy her mind. But as she began leafing through the most recent ledgers, curiosity quickly turned to concern. The numbers did not add up. Expenses far exceeded what the estate's income could reasonably support, and several entries referenced loans she did not recognize, taken out against property she assumed belonged entirely to the Whitmore family. She sat at the small desk for hours, cross-referencing figures, growing more troubled with each page she turned. By the time Eleanor found her there, candles burned low and the rain still falling steadily outside, Adeline had pieced together enough to understand that Duke Alexander Whitmore, for all his cold composure, was a man standing on the edge of financial ruin. "Your Grace, it is nearly time for dinner," Eleanor said gently, glancing at the scattered papers with visible unease. "Perhaps you should not be looking through those without His Grace's knowledge." "Does he know how bad this truly is?" Adeline asked, looking up from the ledger in her hands. Eleanor hesitated, twisting her hands together. "I only manage the household accounts, Your Grace, not the estate's larger finances. But I have heard whispers among the staff. Whispers of debts inherited from his father. Debts that have only grown worse over the years." Adeline closed the ledger carefully, her mind racing. She thought of the cold, controlled man she had married, a man who insisted their marriage meant nothing beyond appearances, and wondered how much of that control was simply a mask for a man drowning quietly, alone, refusing to ask anyone for help. She did not confront him that evening. Instead, she returned to the record room the following day, and the day after that, quietly studying the estate's finances with the same care she had once given her father's failing accounts. She began to understand the shape of the problem, not merely the debts themselves, but the mismanagement behind them, poor investments made years ago, tenant agreements that favored short-term gain over long-term stability, and a steward who seemed either incompetent or dishonest in his handling of the estate's resources. Her opportunity to act came sooner than expected. A tenant family on the northern edge of the estate, the Grahams, had fallen behind on their rent after a poor harvest, and word reached the house that the steward intended to evict them before the month's end, an action that would leave a widow and her 3 children without shelter as winter approached. Adeline acted before she could second-guess herself. She rode out to the tenant cottage herself, accompanied only by a groundskeeper for propriety, and spoke with the widow directly, learning the full circumstances of the family's hardship. She then returned to the estate office and, using her own small allowance along with careful renegotiation of the family's debt terms, arranged for the Grahams to remain in their home through the winter, with a repayment plan structured around the following season's harvest. She did not inform Alexander of any of this. It was not, she reasoned, technically forbidden by the terms of their arrangement, and she saw no reason to trouble him with a matter she had resolved competently on her own. Word of her intervention reached him regardless. 3 days later, when the steward, flustered and defensive, reported the incident during their weekly meeting, framing Adeline's actions as an overstep of her authority within the household. Alexander found her that evening in the small sitting room adjoining her chambers, a place he had never once visited since their wedding day. Adeline looked up in surprise as he entered, closing the door behind him with unusual deliberateness. "I understand you resolved a tenant dispute on the northern edge of the estate," he said, his tone giving away nothing. "I did," Adeline said, setting aside the book she had been reading. "The Graham family would have lost their home in the middle of winter. I found a solution that satisfied the estate's need for repayment while allowing them to remain. Using your own allowance," he said. "Partially," she admitted, "and through a renegotiated repayment structure that should recover the full debt by next autumn, with interest favorable to the estate." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes. "You did this without consulting me. You told me, on our wedding day, that you expected nothing from me beyond appearances at public events," Adeline said carefully. "I assumed managing a tenant dispute fell outside that arrangement entirely, and I did not wish to trouble you with a matter I was capable of resolving myself. That is not the point," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "You went behind my steward's judgment, and you did so with skill I did not expect from you." Adeline lifted her chin slightly, unsure whether his words were meant as criticism or something closer to reluctant admiration. "I grew up managing accounts for my father's estate long before it fell into ruin. I understand ledgers, tenant agreements, and the difference between a steward acting in the estate's best interest and one who is either lazy or dishonest. I suspect, Your Grace, that yours may be the latter." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through his composure for just a moment. "You examined the estate's full accounts." "I did," Adeline said, deciding there was no benefit in hiding it now. "I know about the debts your father left behind. I know they have grown worse under your current steward's management, and I know, though you have not said it aloud to me, that you are far more concerned about the state of this estate than you allow anyone to see." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing, simply staring at her with an expression she could not fully read. She wondered if she had overstepped, if she had exposed too much of what she had discovered, too much of what she suspected about the careful walls he had built around every part of his life. "Show me what you found," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its usual coldness. Relief, and something else, something warmer, moved through her chest. She rose and led him to the record room, where she spent the next several hours walking him through the ledgers she had studied, pointing out discrepancies, questionable investments, and patterns of mismanagement that suggested the steward had been quietly profiting at the estate's expense for years. Alexander listened closely, asking sharp, precise questions, his earlier guardedness slowly giving way to genuine engagement as he absorbed the scope of what she had uncovered. By the time the candles burned low and the household had long since gone to sleep, Something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. A fragile thread of respect where only cold distance had existed before. "I did not expect this from you," he admitted quietly, as she finally closed the last ledger. "I assumed, when I offered your father this arrangement, that I was simply acquiring a wife who would fulfill certain social obligations. I did not anticipate acquiring a partner capable of untangling problems I have struggled with for years. I did not marry you expecting to be useless, Your Grace," Adeline said, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips despite the exhaustion in her bones. "Whatever this marriage is, I intend to be more than simply decorative." Alexander's mouth twitched, the faintest hint of something that might have become a smile under different circumstances, quickly suppressed but not entirely hidden. "Then perhaps," he said, "we should discuss how best to address this steward's dishonesty, together, before it costs this family anything further." It was a small thing, that word "together," spoken so plainly it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Adeline heard it clearly, and something in her chest loosened slightly, a crack forming in the careful distance they had both maintained since their wedding day. Neither of them spoke of what had shifted between them that night, but as Alexander walked her back to her chambers, lingering a moment longer than necessary before bidding her good night, Adeline found herself wondering, for the first time since her wedding, whether this marriage might one day mean something after all. The following morning, Alexander summoned the steward, a narrow-faced man named Edmund Caro, to his study. Adeline sat quietly in the corner of the room, the ledgers stacked neatly before her, while Alexander laid out the discrepancies she had discovered with cold, methodical precision. Caro's confident demeanor crumbled quickly under the weight of the evidence, his explanations growing increasingly tangled as Alexander pressed him on specific transactions that led directly back to accounts under Caro's own name. "You have been skimming profit from tenant repayments for at least 4 years, Alexander said, his voice flat and controlled, though Adeline could hear the fury simmering beneath it. "My wife uncovered what should have been obvious to me long ago had I not trusted you so completely." Caro attempted to argue, to shift blame toward poor harvests and unreliable tenants, but Alexander cut him off with a single raised hand. "You will return what you have taken, in full, or I will see you brought before a magistrate. The choice is yours, and I suggest you make it quickly." By midday, Caro had been dismissed from his position, his belongings packed and removed from the estate before nightfall. Word spread quickly among the household staff, and though no one spoke of it openly in Adeline's presence, she noticed a subtle shift in how the servants regarded her afterward, a new deference in their manner, a recognition that the quiet new duchess was not merely decorative after all. Margaret, predictably, had opinions of her own. She found Adeline in the garden 2 days later, her expression unreadable as she studied her daughter-in-law with the same careful scrutiny she always seemed to carry. "I hear you exposed Caro's dishonesty," Margaret said, without preamble. "I did," Adeline replied, keeping her tone even, unsure what reaction to expect. "My son has ignored the state of this estate's finances for years," Margaret continued, "not from carelessness, but from exhaustion. He inherited debts and burdens far beyond what any young man should have to carry alone, and he has spent every year since trying to hold this family together without allowing anyone close enough to help him carry that weight." "Why are you telling me this?" Adeline asked. Margaret's gaze softened, just slightly, an expression Adeline had not yet seen cross the older woman's face. "Because in 3 weeks, you have accomplished what I could not in 3 years. You found a crack in his armor, and instead of exploiting it for your own comfort, you used it to help him. That is not nothing, Adeline. Whatever this marriage began as, I suspect it may become something neither of you anticipated." Adeline said nothing, uncertain how to respond to such an admission from a woman who had greeted her with such wary distance only weeks before. But she carried Margaret's words with her for the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind as she walked the halls of a house that had begun, slowly and unexpectedly, to feel a little less like a cage and a little more like a place she might one day call home. That evening, Alexander found her again, this time seeking her out rather than being sought, a small but significant shift in the pattern of their days. He carried a small stack of papers, new figures he wished to review with her regarding the estate's recovery plan, and though the conversation began strictly on matters of business, it lingered longer than necessary, drifting into quieter territory neither of them had intended to explore. "You could have simply reported what you found and left the rest to me," Alexander said, watching her across the small table where they had spread their papers. "Why did you go further? Why involve yourself so completely?" Adeline considered the question carefully before answering. Because I understand what it feels like to watch something you love fall apart, quietly, while everyone around you pretends not to notice. I did not want to stand by and watch that happen to you, even if our marriage began as nothing more than an arrangement. Alexander's expression flickered, something raw and unguarded passing briefly across his features before he mastered it once more. You are not at all what I expected, Duchess, he said quietly. Neither, I think, are you, Adeline replied, and for the first time since her wedding day, she saw something that might have almost been a smile settle briefly across her husband's guarded face. The invitation arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, sealed with the crest of the Ashford family, longtime friends of the Whitmore household who hosted an annual gathering at their countryside estate. Alexander read the letter over breakfast, his expression tightening in a way Adeline had come to recognize as reluctance disguised as indifference. We are expected to attend, he said, setting the letter aside. A 3-day gathering. It will require us to appear as a properly devoted couple in front of a house full of society's most attentive gossips. I assumed that was part of our arrangement from the beginning, Adeline said, though something in her chest tightened at the word devoted. At the thought of performing closeness she was no longer entirely certain was pretend. It is, Alexander agreed. I only wish to warn you. These gatherings tend to invite scrutiny, and Lord Ashford's circle includes several individuals who will look for any crack in our story to exploit for their own entertainment. Adeline nodded, though privately she wondered which cracks he meant, the ones they had carefully constructed for public consumption, or the real ones that had begun, quietly and unexpectedly, to form between them over the past weeks. They departed for Ashford Manor 2 days later, arriving to a grand estate filled with music, laughter, and the particular kind of performative warmth that came from a gathering of wealthy families eager to be seen enjoying themselves. Adeline had attended similar events in her old life, though never as the center of attention, and she felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes settle upon her the moment she stepped from the carriage on Alexander's arm. Duchess Whitmore, their hostess, Lady Ashford, greeted warmly, though her sharp eyes swept over Adeline with clear appraisal. We have heard so much about the Duke's sudden marriage. How lovely to finally meet the woman who managed to capture his attention. The pleasure is mine, Adeline replied smoothly, offering a practiced smile despite the underlying insinuation in Lady Ashford's tone. Alexander's hand settled at the small of her back, a small, practiced gesture meant for the watching crowd, though Adeline felt the warmth of his touch linger longer than strictly necessary for their performance. She glanced up at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met in something that felt less like an act and more like genuine understanding. Two people navigating unfamiliar territory together. The evening unfolded in a blur of introductions, forced small talk, and careful observation from every corner of the crowded ballroom. Adeline played her role with practiced grace, laughing at appropriate moments, deflecting pointed questions about the suddenness of her marriage with polite vagueness, and maintaining a steady, composed presence despite the exhausting scrutiny. It was during a brief respite near the refreshment table that Lord Harrison Pierce approached her, his easy smile and confident bearing marking him immediately as a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Duchess Whitmore, he said, bowing slightly. I confess I did not believe the rumors when I first heard them. The elusive Duke of Whitmore, married at last, and to such a striking woman. You must forgive my curiosity. There is little to be curious about, my lord, Adeline replied carefully. Ours is a marriage like any other. Is it? Harrison's eyes gleamed with something sharp and knowing. Forgive me, but I have known Alexander for many years, since our school days in fact. I have never once seen him look at a woman the way he looked at you when you arrived tonight. It was quite unlike him. Adeline felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her best efforts to remain composed. I am certain you are mistaken, my lord. Perhaps, Harrison said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Regardless, I find myself curious about the woman capable of drawing such a reaction from a man so famously guarded. Might I request the pleasure of a dance, Duchess? Purely to satisfy my curiosity, of course. Before Adeline could respond, Alexander appeared at her side, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes carried an unmistakable edge as he regarded Harrison. My wife's dance card is already full for the evening, Pierce, he said smoothly, though the undertone in his voice left little room for argument. Harrison's smile widened, clearly delighted by Alexander's reaction. Of course. I simply could not resist the temptation, given how protective you appear over your new bride, quite unlike the man I remember. He bowed once more and retreated into the crowd, leaving Alexander standing rigidly beside Adeline, his jaw tight with something she could not quite identify. Frustration, perhaps, or something closer to possessiveness that surprised even him. You do not need to speak for me, Adeline said quietly, once Harrison was safely out of earshot. I am capable of declining an unwanted dance on my own. I am aware, Alexander said, though his voice remained tense. Pierce has a reputation for pursuing married women, particularly those he perceives as unhappy in their arrangements. I simply preferred to avoid giving him the opportunity to test that theory with my wife. Your wife, Adeline repeated softly, testing the weight of the words. You say that as though it means something more than a legal arrangement tonight. Alexander's expression flickered, something vulnerable passing briefly across his features before he masked it once more. Perhaps it does, he admitted quietly, so quietly she almost missed it beneath the swell of music filling the ballroom. I find I do not care for the idea of another man pursuing you, regardless of the terms we agreed upon at the beginning of this arrangement. Adeline's heart quickened at his admission, though she said nothing further, unsure how to respond to a shift she had not fully anticipated, even as some hopeful part of her had begun to wish for exactly this. The rest of the evening passed in careful proximity, Alexander remaining close by her side in a way that felt less like performance and more like genuine reluctance to be apart from her. When the dancing began in earnest, he surprised her by requesting the first dance himself, something she suspected he rarely did at such gatherings. His hand settled at her waist as they moved through the steps of a slow, formal dance, and Adeline found herself acutely aware of every point of contact between them, the warmth of his palm through the fabric of her gown, the careful, measured way he guided her across the floor, the intensity of his gaze whenever their eyes met. You dance well, she said, attempting to fill the charged silence between them. My mother insisted upon lessons, he replied, the faintest hint of dry humor coloring his tone. I suspect she hoped it would make me more tolerable in society. I am not certain it succeeded. Adeline laughed softly, genuinely, the sound surprising them both. I find you tolerable enough, Your Grace. High praise indeed, he said, and this time, the smile that touched his lips was unmistakable, small but real, a crack in the careful armor he had worn since the day they met. Later that night, long after the other guests had retired to their rooms, Adeline found herself unable to sleep, restless with the weight of everything that had shifted during the evening. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way to the manor's library, hoping the quiet company of books might settle her thoughts. She found Alexander already there, seated near the fire with a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the flames rather than the page before him. He looked up as she entered, something warm and unguarded flickering across his face before he could stop it. I could not sleep either, she admitted, settling into the chair across from him. These gatherings have always unsettled me, Alexander said. Too many eyes, too many expectations. I find I prefer the quiet of my own study, where no one watches to see whether I am performing correctly. You did not seem to be performing tonight, Adeline said carefully, watching his reaction. Not entirely, at least. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for the right words. No, he admitted finally. I do not believe I was. The silence between them stretched, charged with everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say aloud. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice quieter, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. I was engaged once before, years ago, he said. Her name was Charlotte. I loved her, or believed I did, with the kind of foolish devotion only the very young possess. 3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered she had been using our engagement to secure funds from my family while secretly planning to marry another man, one with a title she found more appealing than mine at the time. Adeline's breath caught, understanding finally dawning as the pieces of Alexander's careful distance began to form a complete picture. Alexander, I am so sorry. I do not tell you this for sympathy, he said, though his voice carried an ache that suggested otherwise. I tell you because I want you to understand why I built the walls I did, why I insisted so firmly that this marriage meant nothing beyond appearances. I could not bear to be made a fool again. To trust someone completely, only to discover their affection was calculated, transactional, false. And now? Adeline asked softly, her heart aching for the guarded, wounded man before her. Do you still believe that of me? Alexander's gaze met hers, steady and searching, as though trying to read the truth written somewhere in her eyes. No, he said finally. I do not believe that of you at all, Adeline. I have watched you these past weeks, watched you solve problems I could not. Defend people who had no claim on your loyalty, speak honestly, even when silence would have been easier. I do not know what to make of the fact that I trust you already, more than I have trusted anyone in years. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected, and Adeline found herself reaching across the small distance separating their chairs, her hand settling gently over his. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled slowly around hers, a small, tentative gesture that felt somehow more intimate than anything that had passed between them since their wedding day. "I did not expect to feel anything for you," she admitted quietly. "I came into this marriage prepared for distance, for loneliness, for a life spent simply fulfilling an obligation. I did not expect to find myself caring for the man behind the walls." "Nor did I," Alexander said, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like wonder. "I have spent 3 years convincing myself that vulnerability leads only to ruin. I am not entirely certain what to do with the fact that you have made me question that conviction in the span of a single month." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, hands still joined, the fire crackling softly before them, neither willing to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. It was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was something undeniable, a foundation built not on contracts or arrangements, but on honesty freely given and gratefully received. When Adeline finally rose to return to her chambers, Alexander walked her to the door, pausing there longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on her face in the dim candlelight. "Good night, Adeline," he said softly, and for the first time, her name in his voice carried something warmer than mere obligation. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, and as she made her way back through the quiet halls of Ashford Manor, she found herself smiling despite every warning in her mind, telling her not to hope for more than she had been promised. The following morning brought with it a change in weather, gray clouds giving way to pale sunshine that spilled across the manor's expansive gardens. Adeline rose early, drawn outside by the promise of fresh air after the emotional weight of the previous night, and found the gardens largely empty save for a few early risers strolling among the hedges. She had not walked far before Harrison Pierce appeared beside her, his easy smile firmly in place, though something more calculating lingered behind his eyes this morning. "Duchess Whitmore," he said, falling into step beside her without invitation. "I hoped I might find you alone. Our conversation last night felt unfinished." "I was not aware there was anything left unsaid, my lord," Adeline replied, keeping her pace steady, refusing to let his presence unsettle her. "Perhaps not from your perspective," Harrison said, his tone shifting into something more direct. "But I confess, I find myself curious about a woman who married a man as guarded as Alexander Whitmore, seemingly overnight, under circumstances everyone assumes were purely financial. I wonder if you are truly content with such an arrangement, or whether some part of you longs for something warmer than what he is capable of offering." Adeline stopped walking, turning to face him directly, her expression carefully composed despite the irritation building beneath her calm exterior. "My lord, I appreciate your curiosity, but I must ask you to direct it elsewhere. My marriage, whatever its origins, is not a puzzle for you to solve, nor an opportunity for you to exploit." Harrison's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, inclining his head in a gesture of mock surrender. "Forgive me, Duchess. I meant no offense. I simply find genuine affection a rare thing in our circles, and I confess I am drawn to it wherever I happen to find it, real or otherwise." "Then I suggest you look elsewhere," Adeline said firmly, "for whatever it is you believe you have found here does not exist in the way you imagine." She left him standing among the hedges and returned to the manor, her earlier peace slightly disturbed by the encounter, though she resolved not to let it overshadow the genuine warmth that had grown between herself and Alexander the night before. She found him in the breakfast room, and something in her expression must have betrayed her lingering irritation, for he set down his cup immediately, his brow furrowing with concern. "What happened?" he asked. "Lord Pierce sought me out in the garden," she admitted, deciding honesty served them better than omission. "He seemed intent on convincing me that our marriage lacks genuine affection, and that I might welcome his attention as a result." Alexander's expression darkened, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "I will speak with him." "That is not necessary," Adeline said quickly. "I handled the matter myself, and firmly. I only tell you because I promised myself I would not keep secrets from you, not after everything shared between us last night." Something in Alexander's expression softened at her words, the tension easing from his shoulders as he reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture that felt entirely natural despite how new it was between them. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "And for handling him yourself. I confess, I am learning quickly that you require far less protection than I initially assumed." "I require partnership," Adeline corrected gently, "not protection. There is a difference, Alexander, and I believe you are beginning to understand it." He studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine settling in his gray eyes. "I believe I am," he said quietly, and the promise in those words carried them both, hand in hand, into the remaining days of their stay at Ashford Manor, closer now than either had imagined possible only weeks before. By the time their carriage departed for Whitmore Hall 3 days later, something fundamental had shifted between them, fragile but real. A bond neither fully understood yet, but both had quietly begun to cherish. The weeks following their return from Ashford Manor brought a quiet, steady transformation to life at Whitmore Hall. Alexander began seeking Adeline out with a regularity that surprised even the household staff, appearing in the record room while she reviewed accounts, joining her for walks through the gardens in the early morning hours, lingering at breakfast long after his papers had been set aside. Their conversations, once stiff and businesslike, grew easier, filled with genuine curiosity about one another's thoughts, memories, and dreams for a future neither had dared imagine when their marriage began. Adeline learned that Alexander had once wanted to travel, that he kept a small collection of maps in his study from countries he had never visited, that he found more comfort in solving practical problems than in navigating the emotional complexities of society. Alexander, in turn, learned that Adeline had always longed for a family who valued her contributions rather than her usefulness, that she found peace in gardens because they reminded her of her mother, who had died when Adeline was still young. "I did not expect this," Alexander admitted one evening, as they sat together in his study, the fire casting warm light across the room. "When my father first suggested strategic marriages years ago, I imagined a lifetime of polite distance, shared obligations without genuine connection. I did not imagine finding someone I actually wished to spend my evenings with." "Neither did I," Adeline said softly, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read. "I imagined survival, Alexander, simply surviving this arrangement with my dignity intact. I did not imagine finding happiness within it." He reached for her hand, an increasingly familiar gesture that still sent warmth spreading through her chest each time it occurred. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to display. "Truly happy, and not simply resigned to circumstances you cannot change?" Adeline considered the question seriously, wanting to give him an honest answer rather than a comforting one. "I am happier than I expected to be," she said finally. "Happier, perhaps, than I have been in a very long time. But I would be lying if I said uncertainty did not linger. This marriage began as a transaction, Alexander, and some part of me still wonders whether what we feel now is genuine, or simply the natural result of two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company." "I understand that fear," Alexander said quietly. "I have carried similar doubts myself. But I do not believe what I feel for you is born merely of loneliness or convenience. I have been surrounded by opportunities for comfort these past years, opportunities I deliberately refused because I could not bear the risk of trusting someone again. What I feel for you is different. It required no convenience, no proximity alone. It grew from watching you choose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, choose honesty when convenient lies would have served you better." His words settled deep in her chest, warm and steadying, and Adeline found herself leaning closer to him, the small distance between their chairs feeling suddenly unbearable. Alexander seemed to sense the shift as well, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes, something unspoken and charged passing between them. "Adeline," he said softly, his voice rough with something she recognized as restrained desire, "I find myself wanting things from this marriage I never expected to want again." "What things?" she asked, her own voice barely above a whisper. "Your trust," he said. "Your companionship, freely given rather than obligated. And perhaps eventually, if you would allow it, something closer to your heart than simple partnership." Adeline's breath caught at his admission, and she found herself reaching up to gently touch his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with careful fingers. "I believe," she said softly, "that you already have more of my heart than either of us anticipated when this began." The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, a question answered rather than a demand made, and when they finally parted, Alexander rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet aftermath of a moment neither had planned but both had clearly wanted. "I have spent 3 years convinced that allowing myself to feel this way again would only lead to ruin," Alexander murmured. "I am beginning to suspect I was wrong." "We do not need to rush this," Adeline said gently, though her own heart raced with hope she had not allowed herself to fully feel until this moment. "We can simply continue as we have been, allowing whatever this is to grow naturally, without the pressure of labels or expectations neither of us is ready for." Alexander nodded, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead before pulling back slightly. though his hand remained entwined with hers. "I would like that," he said. "I would like very much to discover this slowly with you." Their newfound closeness did not go unnoticed by the household. Margaret watched the shift between them with quiet approval, offering fewer sharp remarks and more genuine warmth toward Adeline with each passing week. The servants, too, seemed to sense the change, their formal deference softening into something closer to genuine fondness for the Duchess who had brought unexpected light back into a house that had grown accustomed to shadows. But not everyone regarded the growing bond between Alexander and Adeline with approval. Margaret, despite her outward warmth, harbored private concerns she had not yet voiced, concerns rooted in years of watching her son suffer the consequences of misplaced trust. She began, quietly and without her son's knowledge, making inquiries into Adeline's family circumstances, hoping to reassure herself that the growing affection between the couple was built on solid ground, rather than the same false foundation that had nearly destroyed Alexander once before. Her inquiries led her, unexpectedly, to a letter, one she discovered tucked among correspondence Adeline had received from her father shortly after the wedding. The letter, meant only for Adeline's eyes, spoke candidly of the family's dire financial circumstances before the marriage, referencing debts that would have led to complete ruin without the Duke's intervention, and expressing gratitude, in blunt and practical terms, for the security the marriage had secured. Margaret read the letter with growing unease, not because its contents surprised her. She had always known the marriage began as a financial arrangement, but because of how the letter's language might appear if taken out of context, framed not as gratitude for security, but as calculated manipulation, designed to secure wealth through affection. She sat with the letter for several days, uncertain whether to raise her concerns directly with Adeline, confront Alexander with what she had found, or simply destroy the evidence and allow her son's newfound happiness to continue undisturbed. Each option carried its own risks, and Margaret, despite her often severe exterior, found herself genuinely torn between protecting her son's heart and respecting the privacy of a daughter-in-law she had grown, against her own expectations, to genuinely admire. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around them, Alexander and Adeline continued to grow closer with each passing day. He began involving her more directly in estate matters beyond simple oversight, seeking her counsel on decisions regarding tenant agreements, investment opportunities, and long-term plans for the family's financial recovery. She, in turn, began to see him not as the cold, guarded Duke she had married out of necessity, but as a man capable of genuine warmth, humor, and vulnerability when he allowed himself the freedom to express it. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens beneath a sky scattered with early stars, Alexander stopped and turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had seen it in days. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens, whatever challenges we face together, I do not regret this marriage. I do not regret you, Adeline. You have given me back something I believed I had lost forever, the capacity to trust, to hope, to imagine a future built on something more than obligation." Adeline's eyes filled with unexpected emotion at his words, and she reached up to gently cup his face, drawing him down into a soft, lingering kiss beneath the darkening sky. "Nor do I regret this," she whispered against his lips. "Whatever comes next, Alexander, I am grateful for every moment that has led us here." Neither of them could have anticipated how quickly that gratitude would be tested, nor how soon the fragile trust they had built together would face a challenge threatening to unravel everything they had come to cherish. A few days later, Margaret finally made her decision. She would speak with Adeline directly, giving her the opportunity to explain the letter before drawing any conclusions that might damage the fragile peace settling over the household. She found Adeline in the small sitting room off her chambers, embroidering quietly by the window, and closed the door softly behind her before speaking. "I found a letter from your father," Margaret said without preamble, watching Adeline's reaction carefully. "Written shortly after your wedding. I read it, I confess, before I understood what it truly contained." Adeline's hands stilled over her embroidery, her expression turning wary. "What did it say, Your Grace?" "It spoke of your family's circumstances before the marriage," Margaret said. "Of debts, of ruin narrowly avoided, of gratitude for the security my son's proposal provided. I do not doubt the sincerity of that gratitude, Adeline. But I confess, reading it stirred old fears I had hoped were finally beginning to fade." "You believe I married Alexander purely for financial security?" Adeline said quietly, setting aside her embroidery entirely now, her full attention fixed on her mother-in-law. "I believe that was the original arrangement, yes," Margaret said carefully. "I do not doubt that something genuine has grown between you since. I have watched it happen with my own eyes, and I do not believe you capable of the calculated cruelty that nearly destroyed my son once before. But I worry, Adeline, about how such a letter might appear to others less inclined toward generous interpretation, particularly if it found its way into hands eager to see this marriage fail. Adeline felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. You believe someone might use this letter against us? I believe, Margaret said, that society is filled with people eager to tear down happiness they themselves cannot claim. I only wish to warn you, to prepare you, should such concerns ever reach my son's ears in a form less generous than the truth actually contains. Thank you for telling me, Adeline said, her voice steady despite the anxiety building quietly beneath her composed exterior, and for trusting me enough to raise this concern directly, rather than allowing suspicion to fester in silence. Margaret studied her for a long moment, something like genuine affection softening her severe features. I did not expect to grow fond of you, Adeline. When you first arrived at this house, I confess I have been proven wrong in the most welcome way possible. Whatever challenges may come, know that I stand firmly on your side of this arrangement now, not merely my son's. The conversation left Adeline unsettled long after Margaret departed, a quiet dread building in her chest, despite her best efforts to dismiss it. She told herself the letter was simply a private correspondence between father and daughter, nothing sinister, nothing calculated. But some instinct, sharpened perhaps by the precariousness of her position within this grand and complicated family, warned her that Margaret's concerns were not merely hypothetical, and that the fragile happiness she had found with Alexander might yet face a test neither of them was fully prepared to endure. That night, Alexander found her unusually quiet during dinner, her earlier warmth replaced by a distracted watchfulness she could not quite hide from someone who had grown so attentive to her moods. He waited until they were alone in his study afterward, before gently raising the matter. Something is troubling you, he said, setting aside the papers he had been pretending to review. You have barely spoken since dinner began. Adeline considered, briefly, keeping Margaret's concerns to herself, sparing him the worry until she understood whether there was truly anything to worry about. But she had promised herself honesty in this marriage, and she found she could not begin breaking that promise now, not when so much had already been built on the foundation of truth freely given. Your mother spoke with me today, she said, about a letter from my father, one written shortly after our wedding, discussing my family's circumstances before the marriage. Alexander's expression grew attentive, though not yet alarmed. What concerns did she raise? That such a letter, if it fell into the wrong hands, might be used to suggest I married you purely for financial gain, Adeline said carefully. That whatever has grown between us since might be dismissed as calculated rather than genuine, should anyone wish to frame it that way. Something flickered across Alexander's face, a shadow of old pain resurfacing briefly before he mastered it. And do you believe that framing would be accurate? He asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already trusted her answer. No, Adeline said firmly, closing the distance between them, and taking his hands in hers. I married you out of necessity, Alexander. That much is true, and I will never pretend otherwise. But what I feel for you now has nothing to do with the debts your proposal once settled. It has everything to do with the man I have come to know since, guarded and wounded though you were when we began. Alexander pulled her gently into his arms, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head as he held her close. I believe you, he murmured. Whatever anyone else may think, whatever old letters or old fears may whisper, I know what has grown between us is real. I only hope the rest of the world proves as understanding, should it ever come to that. Neither of them could have known, as they stood together in the quiet warmth of his study that evening, just how soon those words would be tested, nor how painfully close they would come to losing everything they had so carefully built. The letter Margaret had discussed with Adeline in private did not remain private for long. A visiting cousin, staying at Whitmore Hall for a fortnight, discovered the correspondence tucked among papers left carelessly in the record room, where Adeline had been reviewing family correspondence alongside estate matters. The cousin, a woman named Clara with a sharp tongue and little discretion, read the letter without permission and, within days, its contents had spread through whispered conversation into the wider circles of society that regularly gathered at events like the one now unfolding at Whitmore Hall itself. Alexander had organized a modest gathering, a dinner intended to formally introduce Adeline to several prominent families who had not yet had the opportunity to meet her since the wedding. It was meant to be a celebration, a public affirmation of the genuine warmth that had grown between them over the past months. Instead, it became the setting for the most painful confrontation of Adeline's new life. The evening began pleasantly enough, guests arriving in elegant dress, the dining hall glowing with candlelight and filled with polite conversation. Adeline moved through the gathering at Alexander's side, greeting guests with practiced warmth, genuinely enjoying, for the first time, the role she had once approached with such dread. It was during the second course that the whispers began. Subtle at first, guests exchanging knowing glances across the table, conversations pausing awkwardly whenever Adeline approached. She noticed the shift immediately, the warmth of earlier greetings replaced by something colder, more calculating, though she could not immediately identify its source. Margaret noticed it too, her expression tightening with growing alarm as she watched the mood of the gathering shift beneath the surface of polite conversation. She caught Clara's eye across the table and saw, in her cousin's satisfied expression, exactly where the trouble had originated. The confrontation, when it came, arrived without warning, delivered not by Margaret's careful hand but by Clara herself, emboldened by wine, and a cruel satisfaction in being the center of attention for once in her otherwise unremarkable social standing. "Tell me, Duchess," Clara said loudly, her voice carrying across the table during a lull in conversation. "Was it difficult, securing such a fortunate arrangement? I confess, I found your father's letter quite illuminating regarding the true nature of your family's circumstances before this marriage." The table fell silent instantly, every eye turning toward Adeline, whose face drained of color as she realized exactly what Clara referenced. Alexander's expression darkened beside her, his hand tightening protectively around hers beneath the table, though the damage had already begun spreading through the gathered guests like fire through dry grass. "I am not certain what you mean, Clara," Adeline said, keeping her voice steady despite the panic building rapidly in her chest. "Come now," Clara pressed, clearly enjoying the attention her revelation had garnered. "There is no shame in admitting the truth. Your family faced complete ruin, did they not, before the Duke's timely proposal rescued you all from disaster? I simply find it curious how quickly genuine affection seemed to blossom afterward, almost as though gratitude for financial rescue transformed rather conveniently into something resembling love." The insinuation landed like a physical blow, and Adeline felt the weight of dozens of judgmental stares settling upon her. Guests who had, only moments before, treated her with warm hospitality now regarding her with the same calculating suspicion Clara's words had planted so effectively. "That is enough," Alexander said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension with dangerous authority. "My wife's family circumstances before our marriage are not a matter for public discussion, nor are they any indication of the genuine affection that exists between us now." "Of course, Your Grace," Clara said, though her tone remained mockingly sweet. "I meant no offense. I simply find it remarkable how quickly a marriage born of financial necessity transformed, in the eyes of the household staff at least, into something so convincingly romantic. One might almost admire the skill involved in such a performance." Adeline felt tears burning at the edges of her eyes, humiliation and hurt warring with fury at the casual cruelty of Clara's accusation. She glanced desperately toward Alexander, seeking reassurance, seeking the steady support he had offered so consistently over the past weeks. But Alexander, caught off guard by the public nature of the attack, hesitated, his expression torn between defending his wife immediately and processing the shock of having their private circumstances exposed so brutally before an audience of society's most influential families. That hesitation, brief as it was, lasted only a few seconds, but to Adeline, standing exposed and humiliated before dozens of judgmental eyes, it felt like an eternity, and it felt like confirmation of every fear she had quietly carried since the beginning of their marriage. "Adeline," Alexander began, finally finding his voice, reaching for her hand once more. "Please, let me explain to everyone that—" "There is nothing to explain," Adeline interrupted, her voice shaking, despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Clara has spoken the truth, has she not? I did marry you out of necessity. My family was drowning in debt, and your proposal offered salvation. Whatever has grown between us since does not erase that original truth, and clearly, judging by tonight's reaction, no one in this room believes it changes anything at all." "That is not what I meant," Alexander said urgently, rising from his seat as she pulled her hand from his grasp. "Adeline, please, do not let Clara's cruelty poison what we have built together." But the damage had already taken root, humiliation and old insecurities blooming rapidly into something Adeline could not simply reason her way past. Not standing here, exposed before an audience that watched her pain with barely concealed fascination. She rose from the table with as much dignity as she could muster, offering a stiff, formal excuse about needing air, and fled the dining hall before anyone could witness the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Alexander moved to follow her immediately, but Margaret's hand caught his arm, stopping him briefly. "Let her breathe first," Margaret said quietly, though her eyes carried genuine concern, "and deal with Clara before she does further damage tonight." Alexander turned back toward the table, his fury barely contained as he addressed his cousin directly. "You will leave this house tonight, Clara, and you will not return. Whatever satisfaction you found in humiliating my wife tonight, I promise you it will cost you far more than a single evening's cruel entertainment." The remaining guests departed shortly afterward, the gathering effectively ruined, whispered conversations following them out into the night as they speculated about the true nature of the Whitmore marriage and the scandal that had unfolded so publicly at what was meant to be a celebration. Adeline, meanwhile, had retreated to her chambers, where she began, with trembling hands, packing a small trunk with essential belongings. The humiliation of the evening had cracked something open inside her, old fears resurfacing with painful clarity. She had allowed herself to believe, foolishly perhaps, that what existed between herself and Alexander was genuine, untainted by the transactional origins of their marriage. But Alexander's hesitation at the dinner table, however brief, had shattered that belief entirely, confirming her deepest fear that some part of him, and certainly all of society, would always view their relationship through the lens of calculated necessity rather than genuine affection. She was still packing when Eleanor found her, the young maid's expression filled with concern, as she watched Adeline moving frantically between wardrobe and trunk. "Your Grace, surely you do not intend to leave," Eleanor said softly. "I cannot remain in a house where my own husband hesitates to defend me, where guests believe my affection for him is nothing more than calculated performance," Adeline said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I was foolish to believe this could ever be more than what it began as, Eleanor." Tonight made that painfully clear. It was at that moment, as Adeline continued her frantic packing, that an unexpected visitor arrived at Whitmore Hall, one whose timing could not have been more precisely calculated for maximum advantage. Lord Harrison Pierce, having heard whispers of the evening's scandal traveling quickly through society's gossip networks, arrived at the estate under the pretense of concern, though his true motivations remained far less noble. He found Adeline in the entrance hall, her trunk already loaded onto a hastily summoned carriage, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and fierce determination to leave before Alexander could stop her. "Duchess Whitmore," Harrison said, his tone carefully sympathetic despite the calculating gleam in his eyes, "I heard what happened tonight. I came as quickly as I could, concerned for your well-being." "That is kind of you, my lord, but unnecessary," Adeline said, though exhaustion and hurt had worn down her earlier firmness in declining his attention. "Please, allow me to offer my carriage, my protection, wherever you wish to go tonight," Harrison pressed gently. "You should not have to face such humiliation alone, Adeline, particularly not from a husband who could not even bring himself to defend you properly before his own guests." The words struck a painful chord, echoing her own private fears back to her with uncomfortable precision. For a brief, vulnerable moment, standing exhausted and heartbroken in the entrance hall of a house that suddenly felt more like a cage than a home, Adeline found herself genuinely considering his offer, considering the possibility of simply leaving this entire painful arrangement behind and starting somewhere new, somewhere free of judgment and hesitation and old insecurities that refused to stay buried. "Perhaps," she said quietly, more to herself than to Harrison, "perhaps that would be simplest." Meanwhile, in the moments before Alexander finally located her, he had remained in his study, wrestling with the weight of what had happened at dinner. Margaret had followed him there, watching her son pace the length of the room with barely contained agitation. "You hesitated," Margaret said quietly, not unkindly, simply stating what they both already knew. "In front of everyone, when Clara attacked her, you hesitated before defending your wife." "I know," Alexander said, running a hand through his hair, frustration and self-recrimination evident in every line of his body. "I do not know why. The shock of it, perhaps. The horror of watching something so private exposed so cruelly, before an audience I never wanted involved in our lives at all. I hesitated for only a moment, but I saw her face. Mother, I saw exactly what that hesitation cost her." "Then go to her," Margaret said firmly. "Do not stand here explaining yourself to me, when the woman who deserves that explanation is somewhere in this house, likely believing every fear she has carried since her wedding day has just been confirmed." Alexander did not need to be told twice. He left his study immediately, moving through the halls with growing urgency as he searched first her chambers, finding them empty save for an overturned jewelry box and signs of hasty packing that sent ice through his veins. He questioned a passing servant who directed him toward the entrance hall, and he quickened his pace, dread building with every step at the thought of losing her before he had the chance to properly explain himself. He rounded the final corner just in time to hear the tail end of Harrison's carefully constructed sympathy, the practiced concern in his rival's voice unmistakable even from a distance. Alexander's blood ran cold at the sight of the loaded carriage waiting outside, at the sight of Adeline standing so close to leaving, her expression torn between heartbreak and something dangerously close to resignation. "Adeline," Alexander said, his voice breaking the tense silence that had settled over the entrance hall. Both Adeline and Harrison turned toward him, surprise evident on both their faces at his sudden arrival. Harrison recovered first, his expression shifting into something smug and satisfied. "Ah, Alexander, I was simply offering the Duchess comfort and transportation, given the unfortunate scene at dinner tonight. It seems you have arrived just in time to watch her make her own decision about her future, free from whatever obligations you believe still bind her to this house." "Stay out of this, Pierce," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous, though his eyes remained fixed entirely on Adeline, searching her face for some sign of what she truly wanted, some indication of whether he had already lost her completely. "Adeline, please, give me a moment to explain myself before you leave this house believing something that is not true." Adeline studied him for a long moment, torn between the desperate hope building in her chest at his obvious distress, and the lingering hurt from watching him hesitate so publicly only hours before. "You had your moment tonight, Alexander," she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less pained, "in front of everyone who mattered, when Clara humiliated me, when the entire room questioned whether anything real exists between us at all. You hesitated. I saw it clearly, and so did every guest at that table." "I know," Alexander said, taking a careful step closer, his expression raw with an honesty she had never seen him display so openly. "I have no excuse for that hesitation, Adeline, none that would satisfy the hurt it caused you. But I beg you, do not let a few seconds of shocked silence erase everything genuine that has grown between us these past months. Do not let Harrison Pierce's timely arrival tonight convince you that leaving with him represents any kind of true escape from pain, rather than simply trading one uncertainty for another, far less trustworthy." Harrison bristled at the direct accusation, though Alexander did not spare him another glance, his full attention remaining fixed on Adeline, on the war of emotions playing openly across her face, as she weighed his words against the fresh wound of humiliation still burning in her chest. "Give me tonight," Alexander said softly, closing the remaining distance between them, though he stopped short of touching her, respecting the fragile boundary her hurt had drawn between them. "Allow me the chance to prove that my hesitation tonight was shock, not doubt, fear of losing you publicly, rather than any question of your worth, or the genuine nature of what we share. If, after hearing me out completely, you still wish to leave, I will not stop you. I will arrange safe passage anywhere you wish to go, and I will not trouble you further. But please, Adeline, do not walk away from something real because of a mistake born from surprise rather than truth." The entrance hall fell silent, Harrison watching with narrowed eyes as Adeline considered Alexander's plea, her hand still resting on the strap of her traveling bag, torn between the safety of leaving and the terrifying vulnerability of choosing to stay and trust him once more. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken, while Harrison watched from a few feet away, his earlier confidence beginning to waver as he sensed the tide of the moment shifting away from his favor. Adeline finally set down her traveling bag, though her expression remained guarded, uncertain. "Speak then," she said quietly. "Tell me why I should believe your hesitation tonight meant nothing, when it felt, in that moment, like confirmation of every doubt I have carried since our wedding day." Alexander nodded, gratitude and relief flooding his features at the small opening she had offered him. "When Clara spoke tonight, exposing something so private before an audience I never wanted involved in our lives, I froze. Not because I doubted you, Adeline, not because any part of me questioned the genuine nature of what has grown between us. I froze because I was furious, and heartbroken, and terrified all at once, watching you exposed and hurt before people who had no right to witness something so personal. I did not know in that instant how to defend you properly without giving Clara exactly the reaction she was hoping to provoke. That does not erase the hurt of watching you hesitate," Adeline said, though her voice had softened slightly, listening rather than simply reacting. "I know," Alexander said, "and I am not asking you to erase that hurt, only to understand that it came from shock and fury, not from doubt about you, about us, about everything we have built together these past months. Adeline, I love you. I have known it for weeks now, though I was too much of a coward to say it aloud. afraid that speaking such words might somehow shatter the fragile happiness we had found together. I regret that cowardice now more than I can express, because it left you standing alone tonight, uncertain of my devotion when I should have declared it plainly, immediately, without hesitation. The words hung in the air between them, and Adeline felt her carefully guarded heart crack open at his admission, tears filling her eyes once more, though this time they carried something closer to relief than heartbreak. "You love me," she repeated softly, testing the weight of the words. "I do," Alexander said firmly, closing the last of the distance between them, his hands gently framing her face as he searched her eyes for permission to continue. "I love you, Adeline Foster Whitmore, not because of any obligation this marriage once demanded, but because of who you are, the strength you have shown me, the kindness you have offered everyone in this house who needed it, the honesty you have given me, even when it would have been easier to remain silent. I do not want you to leave tonight. I do not want you to leave ever, not for Harrison Pierce, not for anyone. I want you to stay because you choose to, freely, without the weight of any arrangement binding you here beyond your own genuine desire." Harrison, sensing the moment slipping entirely beyond his control, made one final attempt to intervene. "Adeline, surely you can see this is simply desperation speaking, a man realizing too late what he stands to lose. Do not let pretty words tonight erase the pattern of coldness that defined this marriage from its very beginning." Alexander turned toward him then, his expression hardening with a fierce protectiveness that left no room for further argument. "You will leave this house immediately, Pierce, and you will not return. Whatever game you believed you were playing tonight, exploiting my wife's pain for your own advantage, ends now, permanently." Harrison hesitated, glancing toward Adeline one final time, searching for some sign that she might still choose to leave with him despite Alexander's declaration. But what he found instead was a woman looking at her husband with an expression that left no doubt about where her heart truly belonged, an expression of love finally allowed to surface fully, without fear or hesitation clouding its truth. Recognizing his defeat, Harrison offered a stiff, humiliated bow before departing into the night, his carriage rolling away from Whitmore Hall without another word exchanged. Adeline watched him go, then turned back to Alexander, her hands finally reaching up to cover his where they still gently cradled her face. "I love you too," she said softly, the words spilling free at last, unburdened by the fear that had kept them locked away until this precise moment. "I have loved you for weeks now, Alexander, though I told myself it was foolish to hope for something so genuine, to grow from an arrangement that began so coldly. Tonight frightened me, not because I doubted your feelings, but because I feared that everyone else would always see us through the lens of that original transaction, regardless of what genuinely exists between us now." "Let them see whatever they wish," Alexander said fiercely, pulling her fully into his arms, holding her close against his chest, as though he could somehow protect her from every future cruelty, simply through the strength of his embrace. "I do not care what society believes about the origins of our marriage. I care only about the truth we know together, the love that has grown here despite every obstacle placed in its path. I will spend the rest of my life proving that truth to you, Adeline, publicly and privately, for as long as you will allow me the privilege." They stood together in the quiet entrance hall for a long moment, simply holding each other, the tension and fear of the evening slowly dissolving into something warm and steady, a foundation finally strong enough to withstand whatever challenges might come. Margaret, who had followed at a discreet distance, watched from the shadowed doorway with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, relief and joy mingling as she witnessed her son finally allowing himself the happiness she had long feared he would never permit himself to claim. The following morning, Alexander insisted on addressing the scandal directly, refusing to allow whispered speculation to define the narrative of their marriage any longer. He arranged a small gathering, inviting several of the same families who had witnessed the previous evening's painful scene, along with a few additional guests whose good opinion mattered most within their social circles. Standing before them, with Adeline at his side, Alexander spoke plainly about the true nature of their relationship, acknowledging openly that their marriage had indeed begun as a practical arrangement, one that had, over the months since, transformed into something he valued more than anything else in his life. "I will not pretend our beginning was anything other than what it was," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled gathering. "My wife's family faced genuine hardship, and our marriage offered a solution to that hardship. But what has grown between us since bears no resemblance to calculation or convenience. Adeline has shown me kindness, strength, and honesty I did not believe myself capable of receiving again after past betrayals nearly convinced me such things were impossible to trust. I love her completely, without reservation, and I will not allow anyone's cruel speculation to diminish that truth. The gathered guests, many of whom had witnessed genuine affection between the couple even before the previous night's scandal, seemed largely satisfied by his honest declaration, and the whispered rumors that had threatened to define their marriage began, slowly, to fade beneath the weight of Alexander's public devotion. In the weeks that followed, Alexander made good on his promise, courting Adeline with a tenderness and openness that left no doubt in anyone's mind about the genuine nature of their bond. He surprised her with small gestures, a garden planted with her favorite flowers, quiet evenings spent simply talking by the fire, public displays of affection that would have seemed entirely foreign to the cold, guarded man she had married those months before. Margaret, too, embraced Adeline fully now, any lingering wariness replaced entirely by genuine affection and gratitude for the woman who had brought her son back to life after years of guarded isolation. The household staff, sensing the genuine warmth that now filled Whitmore Hall, moved through their duties with renewed energy and joy, the estate itself seeming to breathe easier beneath the weight of happiness that had settled into its previously cold walls. 6 months after their wedding day, Alexander arranged a small private ceremony in the same chapel where they had first exchanged vows born of necessity rather than love. This time, surrounded only by family and the closest friends who had witnessed their genuine devotion, he renewed those vows with words spoken from the heart, promising to cherish, protect, and love Adeline for the rest of their lives together, freely and completely, without the shadow of obligation that had once defined their union. Adeline, standing before him in the same chapel where she had once feared a lifetime of cold distance, felt tears of pure joy streaming down her face as she repeated her own vows, this time chosen entirely by her own heart rather than circumstance. "I once believed this marriage meant nothing beyond survival," she said softly, her voice carrying through the small, intimate gathering. "I know now that it means everything, Alexander. You have given me a home, a family, and a love I never dared hope to find. I promise to cherish that gift for the rest of my life." As they sealed their renewed vows with a kiss, the same chapel that had once witnessed such cold formality now overflowed with genuine warmth and joy, a testament to how completely two guarded hearts could heal when finally given the courage to trust one another fully. Outside, spring sunshine spilled across the grounds of Whitmore Hall, chasing away the last shadows of winter that had once defined the estate's cold, isolated atmosphere. Inside, Alexander and Adeline began their true marriage at last, not bound by necessity or obligation, but joined freely by a love strong enough to weather scandal, doubt, and every challenge that had once threatened to keep them apart. Before the ceremony, in the quiet hours of that spring morning, Eleanor had helped Adeline prepare, fastening the buttons of her gown with careful hands, tears gathering in her own eyes as she worked. "I remember your first night here, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly. "You seemed so alone, so uncertain. I did not know then whether this house would ever feel like home to you." "Neither did I," Adeline admitted, studying her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her now, radiant with a happiness she had never dared expect. "I am glad to have been wrong, Eleanor. This house has become more than a home. It has become everything I did not know I was missing." Eleanor smiled, wiping quickly at her eyes before returning to her task. "The Duke is a different man now, Your Grace, since you arrived. The whole household has noticed it. He smiles now. He laughs, sometimes, in the mornings when he does not think anyone is watching. Whatever you have done, however you managed to reach him after everything that came before, I believe this entire house owes you a debt of gratitude." Adeline reached for Eleanor's hand, squeezing it gently. "He reached toward me just as much as I reached toward him, Eleanor. It was never one-sided. I think, perhaps, we simply found each other at exactly the moment we both needed someone brave enough to try." Downstairs, Alexander waited near the chapel entrance, adjusting his cravat with unusual nervousness for a man renewing vows he had already spoken once before. Margaret found him there, studying her son's uncharacteristic fidgeting with quiet amusement. "You survived the first wedding without such nerves," she observed. "I confess, I find this version rather endearing." "The first wedding meant nothing to me beyond obligation," Alexander said honestly. "This one means everything. I find the weight of that difference rather difficult to steady myself against." Margaret's expression softened, her hand coming to rest gently on his arm. "Your father would have been proud of the man you have become, Alexander. Not the guarded, distant Duke you were forced into becoming after everything with Charlotte, but the man standing here now, finally brave enough to claim happiness when it found him. I am proud of you as well, more than I have properly expressed these past months." Alexander covered his mother's hand with his own, gratitude thick in his throat. "Thank you, Mother, for your patience, your honesty, and for trusting Adeline when I know it would have been easier to remain guarded on my behalf." "She earned that trust herself," Margaret said simply. "I merely had the sense to recognize it when I saw it." Word of the Duke's happiness had spread beyond the estate as well, reaching even the tenant families who had benefited from Adeline's early intervention on their behalf. The widow Graham, whose home Adeline had saved from eviction those many months before, sent a small bouquet of wildflowers to the chapel that morning, along with a handwritten note expressing gratitude and joy on behalf of her entire family, now settled comfortably and current on their repayment plan thanks to the harvest's improved fortunes. Adeline read the note with tears in her eyes, touched that the small act of kindness she had offered so early in her marriage had circled back to bless this most important day. She tucked the note carefully into her bodice, close to her heart, a reminder that the love she had found with Alexander had grown alongside a broader capacity for compassion that had transformed not only their marriage, but the entire estate and everyone connected to it. The ceremony itself unfolded with a warmth entirely absent from their first wedding day. Sunlight streamed through the chapel's tall windows, illuminating the small gathering of family and friends who had witnessed the genuine transformation of a marriage born from necessity into one built on freely chosen love. When Alexander spoke his renewed vows, his voice carried none of the cold formality that had marked their first exchange, replaced instead by open, unguarded devotion that left few dry eyes among the assembled witnesses. He had once told her, on their wedding day, that their marriage meant nothing beyond a signature and a title. In the end, it had come to mean everything. A love neither of them had expected to find, built from the unlikely foundation of a bargain that had, against all odds, become the truest gift either of them had ever received. A year passed, and Whitmore Hall had become a house filled with a warmth few who remembered its earlier years could have imagined possible. Alexander rose each morning eager for the day rather than dreading it, and Adeline had settled fully into her role, not as a decorative duchess fulfilling obligations, but as a true partner shaping the estate's future alongside her husband. The estate itself had recovered remarkably from the financial troubles that had once threatened its stability. With Caro gone and honest management restored, combined with Adeline's careful oversight of tenant agreements and investments, Whitmore Hall now stood on solid financial ground for the first time in over a decade. Alexander often credited his wife publicly for the transformation, though Adeline always insisted the success belonged to both of them equally. A partnership built on mutual respect rather than singular achievement. Their happiness, however, did not remain untested by new challenges. Late that spring, word arrived that Charlotte, the woman whose betrayal had once shattered Alexander's capacity for trust, had returned to society after several years abroad, her second marriage having recently ended in scandal of its own making. She requested, through a mutual acquaintance, a private meeting with Alexander, citing a desire to make amends for the pain she had caused him years before. Alexander received the request with visible unease, uncertain whether confronting his past directly would reopen wounds he had worked so hard to heal, or whether it might finally offer the closure he had never permitted himself to seek. He discussed the matter openly with Adeline that evening, grateful, as always, for a marriage built on honesty rather than concealment. "Do you wish to see her?" Adeline asked, watching him carefully across the quiet study where they now spent most evenings together, a habit neither had ever grown tired of. "I am not certain," Alexander admitted. "Part of me believes confronting that chapter directly might finally release whatever lingering hold it still holds over me. Another part fears that seeing her again might unearth feelings I believed long buried." "Whatever you decide," Adeline said gently, reaching across to take his hand. "Know that I trust you completely, Alexander. I do not fear Charlotte's return, nor do I fear whatever conversation might unfold between you. I only wish for you to find whatever peace you still require." Alexander studied his wife for a long moment, gratitude and love swelling in his chest at her steady, unwavering support. "I believe I would like to see her," he said finally. "Not to reopen old wounds, but to finally close a chapter that has shaped far too much of who I became before you arrived in my life." The meeting took place a week later, in a private drawing room at a mutual friend's residence, chosen deliberately as neutral ground. Alexander arrived composed, though Adeline could sense his nervousness beneath the calm exterior he presented as he departed that morning. She spent the hours of his absence occupied with estate matters, though her thoughts drifted repeatedly toward wondering how the conversation might unfold. Charlotte, when Alexander finally saw her again, looked older than he remembered, the years and evident hardship of her own choices having stripped away much of the careless confidence that had once defined her. She greeted him with visible nervousness, clearly uncertain of her welcome. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, gesturing for him to sit across from her. "I imagine this is difficult, given everything that happened between us." "It is," Alexander admitted honestly, "though perhaps not in the way you might expect." Charlotte studied him carefully, noting, perhaps, the ease and confidence he carried now, so different from the guarded young man she had once known. "You seem well," she observed. "Happy, even. I confess I did not expect that, given how our engagement ended." "I am happy," Alexander said simply. "Happier than I believed possible, in fact, for many years after you left. I have married again, to a woman who has taught me that trust, once broken, can still be rebuilt with the right person, in the right circumstances." Charlotte's expression flickered with something that might have been regret, or perhaps simply the recognition of happiness she herself had never quite managed to secure despite her calculated choices years before. "I am glad," she said, and though Alexander studied her closely for any sign of insincerity, he found none. "I have thought often of what I did to you, Alexander. The pain I caused, the trust I broke so carelessly for reasons that, in hindsight, brought me little genuine happiness at all. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wished, at least, to offer a genuine apology, one I should have given years ago." Alexander considered her words carefully, searching within himself for the anger and betrayal that had once defined his every thought of her. He found, to his genuine surprise, that much of that old pain had already faded, replaced gradually over the past year by the steady, healing presence of a marriage, built on everything Charlotte's betrayal had once convinced him was impossible to find. "I accept your apology," he said finally, "and I release whatever anger I once carried toward you. I cannot claim the years since have been easy, Charlotte, nor can I pretend your choices did not shape me in ways that took considerable time to overcome. But I have found happiness since, genuine happiness, and I find I no longer wish to carry the weight of old resentment when so much good has grown in its place." They spoke for a while longer, discussing, with surprising ease, the years that had passed and the different paths their lives had taken. When Alexander finally departed, he felt lighter than he had in years. A final piece of his past finally settled, allowing him to move forward into his future with Adeline, unburdened by lingering shadows. He returned home to find Adeline waiting in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. She rose as he approached, searching his face for some sign of how the meeting had unfolded. "How are you?" she asked softly. "Free," Alexander said, pulling her into his arms, resting his chin gently atop her head, as they watched the last light of day fade into evening. "Finally, completely free of everything that once kept me guarded and distant. I have you to thank for that, Adeline, more than you will ever fully know." "You did that work yourself," Adeline said, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. "I simply loved you through it." That autumn, further joy arrived when Adeline discovered she was carrying their first child, news that filled Whitmore Hall with renewed excitement and anticipation. Margaret, overjoyed at the prospect of grandchildren after years of quiet worry that her son might never find happiness enough to build a family of his own, threw herself into preparations with an energy that surprised the entire household. Alexander, for his part, found himself alternating between overwhelming joy and gentle nervousness as he adjusted to the reality of impending fatherhood, though Adeline noted, with quiet amusement, that his careful, methodical nature translated well into thoughtful preparation for their growing family. "You will be a wonderful father," she told him one evening, as they sat together reviewing plans for the nursery, a project Alexander had approached with the same careful precision he once reserved solely for estate ledgers. "Our child will never doubt, even for a moment, how deeply they are loved. And I intend to make certain of that," Alexander said firmly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "No child of ours will ever grow up believing love requires calculation or transaction, not after everything we ourselves have learned about what genuine devotion truly means." As winter approached once more, nearly 2 years after their marriage had begun as nothing more than a practical arrangement between strangers, Alexander and Adeline found themselves settled into a life neither could have imagined on that cold wedding day, when he had declared, so firmly, that their union meant nothing beyond appearances. In the quiet months that followed, as Adeline's confinement drew nearer, the household settled into a gentle rhythm of anticipation. Alexander insisted on accompanying her for every walk through the gardens, however brief, and Margaret took to reading aloud from old family journals in the evenings, sharing stories of Whitmore ancestors and the estate's long history, with an enthusiasm Adeline had never seen from her before. One evening, as the first snow of the season began drifting past the tall windows of the drawing room, Alexander surprised Adeline with a small, wrapped gift, presented with none of the careful formality that had once defined so much of his early behavior toward her. "What is this?" she asked, curious, as she carefully unwrapped the small parcel to reveal a delicate locket, engraved on its surface with a single simple word: chosen. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you, always, that whatever began this marriage, everything since has been chosen freely. By both of us," Alexander explained, watching her reaction closely. "I know the early months were difficult, filled with uncertainty, and old wounds neither of us expected to heal so completely. I wanted you to carry a reminder that none of what followed was obligation. All of it, every part of the life we have built together, was chosen, again and again, by two people who found each other, despite everything working against them." Adeline's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck, her fingers tracing the engraved word with quiet reverence. "I will treasure this always," she said softly, "just as I treasure you, Alexander, and everything we have built together since that first frightening day at the altar." Winter deepened, and finally, on a cold morning in late January, their daughter arrived, healthy and strong, filling Whitmore Hall with the sound of a newborn's cry for the first time in over a generation. They named her Margaret, after her grandmother, whose careful wisdom and eventual warmth had shaped so much of the family's healing, and the older Margaret wept openly with joy upon hearing the news, cradling her tiny namesake with a tenderness the household had rarely witnessed from the once severe Dowager Duchess. Alexander stood beside Adeline's bed in the quiet hours following the birth, watching his wife cradle their daughter with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love that still, even after everything they had overcome together, occasionally caught him by surprise with its intensity. "She is perfect," he murmured, gently touching his daughter's tiny hand, marveling at the impossibly small fingers that curled instinctively around his own. "She is," Adeline agreed, exhaustion and joy mingling in her voice as she looked between her husband and their newborn daughter. "Our whole family is perfect, Alexander, in ways I never dared imagine possible on the day we married." "Nor did I," Alexander admitted, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to Adeline's forehead, then another to their daughter's soft crown. "But I am endlessly grateful, every single day, that fate brought us together, even under circumstances neither of us would have chosen at the time. Whatever began as necessity became, through your courage and honesty, the truest happiness I have ever known." As spring returned once more to Whitmore Hall, bringing new blooms to the gardens Adeline had come to love so deeply, the family settled into the comfortable rhythm of a life built on genuine devotion rather than obligation. The estate thrived under their combined stewardship, the tenants prospered under fair and honest management, and the halls that had once echoed with cold silence now filled regularly with laughter, warmth, and the simple, everyday joy of a family finally whole. Alexander often thought back to that first cold morning, standing at the altar, declaring so firmly that their marriage meant nothing beyond a signature and a title. He marveled, still, at how completely those words had been proven wrong, at how a bargain born of desperation and necessity had grown, through patience and courage and the slow, steady work of choosing each other again and again, into the deepest and most enduring love he had ever known. It had, in the end, come to mean absolutely everything, a testament to the possibility that even the coldest beginnings could grow, given patience, honesty, and courage, into the warmest and most enduring of loves.